Whoever wins that Republican nomination is almost guaranteed to win the general election. It's essentially, at that point, it's done. What difference does that make? What's the distinction here in terms of, does it really matter? Hey, if Republican's going to win the Republican, the Democrat's going to win the Democrat, we'll just vote in the fall, right? A friend of mine used to say there are two major parties. There's the evil party and the stupid party. And periodically, the stupid party conspires with the evil party to do something evil and stupid. You can decide for yourself which is which. When we look at the standard, we can find one of the simplest one in Exodus 18:21. And the context there is when Jethro came to Moses during the Exodus. And we well know the nature by this point of the tendency of the people to grumble, complain, and already even spotted God's major miracles of the Exodus itself, of the parting of the Red Sea, of these miracles occurring, that they still wanted to grumble and complain. Pastors, we care because it's God's authority that we are charged with delegating. The primary election is an important junction in the process of choosing godly leaders to government. Welcome to the Christian Citizen, part of the ministry of U.S. Pastor Council. We take head on the mission of restoring godly citizenship as an effective ministry of the local Bible-believing pastor and church. Man calls it politics, but God calls it ministry, and our mission of, by, and for pastors is to bring a united biblical voice to the critical issues of our day. Scripture speaks to all issues impacting lives, and so should our pulpits. Join us for today's program. On today's edition of the Christian Citizen Podcast, we're going to be talking about something that's on a lot of people's minds. It's in all the headlines, news everywhere, talking about the 2024 primary elections. And of course, that goes all the way from the presidential level all the way down to local elections as well. And of course, the presidential race gets most of the airwave coverage and a lot of the media coverage. But we're going to talk about the primary election in terms of its purpose. And there's also what we call the Texas two-step voting in process that we have to also understand, because there's actually ways we will vote twice in the primary election in two different ways that we can have an impact in the system in terms of not only who's chosen in the primary elections, but also how the political parties operate. So just think of it in these terms. Last night in Houston, Texas, they held the National College Football Championship, in which Michigan and Washington played for the championship right here. And now I happen to be a native of Washington State, so I was kind of rooting for the Huskies. Didn't go so well for them. But here's how they got there. They didn't start out last August and say, well, you know what, Michigan, you're going to be in the championship. Washington, you're going to be in the championship. They had to earn their way there. Well, the process is in the sense of eliminating along the way. Once you get to the playoffs, what happens? Two teams are put up against each other. The winner of that game continues on to the next level in the playoffs, right? We all understand how that works. Well, the primary election process is basically the same objective. When we go to vote for the president in the fall, in November of 2024, that president, those candidates for each major political party will have had to win their primary nominations. Now, there's a convoluted process nationally for the presidential nomination, and I'm not going to get into those weeds today because it's a complicated process. Some states have primary elections, some states have caucuses, some have both, like Texas. The objective here is to understand how critically important the primary election is, because you don't get to vote for who you want to in November if they don't win the primary. And very often we'll hear this phrase, well, only so-and-so can beat so-and-so from the other party, for example. We heard this, well, just every election cycle, we'll often hear that phrase, vote for so-and-so in the primary because they're the only one running in that primary for their party that can beat the other guy, whoever that happens to be. Well, the truth of the matter is you have to get through the primary in order to run for the position and actually get elected to it in the general election. Okay? Now, some people would think, okay, Dave, yeah, duh, that we get that. No, most people don't. If we did, and we really understood how important that was, would be showing up and participating in the primary elections. We have a dilemma of so many fewer voters participating in the primary than do in the general elections. And what that means is you've already abdicated possibly the best candidate that you would have liked to have voted for because you didn't show up and vote in the primary. So when the general election time comes, you get to choose between what we call the lesser of two evils. So our charge to the church and our pastors is this: we are 8 weeks out right now from the primary in Texas. We are 6 weeks out from early voting in Texas. So you can actually start voting for your primary candidates in 6 weeks. The primary ballots are all completed, and everybody who wanted to run for those offices had to have filed back in January. All the campaigns are going full speed. There's information going out there, and there are positions from judiciary position for civil court judge, criminal court judges, justices of the peace, county office positions, and of course, state legislative positions, both the House and the Senate. Think about this: if there's 100,000 voters in a district, we'll say, and there's 100,000 eligible voters, and let's say that 70% of those eligible voters are actually registered to vote. That means only 70,000 can cast a ballot. Now, out of those 70,000, in a presidential election year, the primary turnout's typically higher because people want to go out and vote for the presidential position. But that means that probably 1/3 of those 70,000 may cast a ballot. If we have a really rocket and rolling year, maybe it could get up to 40%. But what does that mean? I mean, let's just say this year is going to be a very competitive year, active year, interested year, and 40% of the eligible voters cast a vote in the primary election. So that means 40% of the 70,000. How many is that then? That's 28,000. So 28,000 voters would cast a vote out of the 70 in that primary election. How many does it take to win? Well, you have to get 50% plus one in order to win the nomination outright. So the half of 28,000 is 14,001. So remember, we started out with 100,000 eligible voters. So 100,000 eligible voters, but 14,001 is the magic number that actually will choose that nominee if they participate. And that's the minimum you have to have. Now, of course, a candidate could win 50 or 60% of that primary. But there will also be the runoff elections coming up as well in later in the spring. In fact, the date for the runoff election here in Texas is May 8th. So there will be a May 8th runoff election for any of those races that don't get in which no candidate receives over 50% of the vote. And so we'll get to vote again. And not every place will have runoffs, some places will. But where there are going to be runoffs, we've got to mobilize the voters on that too. And what difference does that make? What's the distinction here in terms of, does it really matter? Hey, if Republican's going to win the Republican, the Democrat's going to win the Democrat, we'll just vote in the fall, right? Well, some of the frustration in both the major party process here is the fact that we have, as well, a friend of mine used to say there are two major parties. There's the evil party and the stupid party. And periodically, the stupid party conspires with the evil party to do something evil and stupid. You can decide for yourself which is which. But the point is that somebody running as a Republican in the primary election is saying, I'm choosing to align myself with this particular political party and its platform and its principles, and I want you to choose me to represent those voters in this district. So that's the nature of the primary. Now, let's say that you have a platform that states that the party believes in the absolute sanctity of all innocent human life, exception until natural death. It believes in traditional marriage between one natural man and one natural woman. It believes in religious freedom as defined by our U.S. Constitution and so forth. We believe limited governments. It believes in lower regulations, lower taxes, so forth. That's kind of the basic framework of this party. This party over here believes in the absolute position of unrestricted abortion up until and after birth. And there should be no restrictions on that abortion. And that there is no such thing as distinction between male and female, that gender and sex are two different things. You can be a biological male, but be a female. You can identify as a female, dress and live and act like a female. You can switch back and forth. You can have yourself mutilated and try to pretend you're the other. And you believe that the government essentially is the highest authority, that with the state should be in control of all the property, all the wealth, and should control things like speech. Those are some examples of the distinctions between the two major parties. So candidates are going to choose a party, and they say, "I'm going to run for this party's nomination based on these principles that I agree with." Now, then the voters of that particular party then choose amongst those candidates. Now, this is where it gets rather confusing and frustrating, because let's just say in Texas, for example, many of the districts are designed to be heavily Republican or heavily Democrat. There are not too many that are truly swing districts. And in those districts, for example, that are not swing, but for example, are heavily Republican, whoever wins that Republican nomination is almost guaranteed to win the general election. It's essentially, at that point, it's done. So what does that mean? It means if you have 10 candidates running for the Republican nomination, they're not all the same. They're not all the same in experience, not all the same in character, they're not all the same in philosophy, and they're not all the same in their motivations. So how do you tell the difference, and does it matter? Well, let's look at the recent Texas legislative session, in which a number of Republicans conspired with the Democrat Party to try to impeach the Attorney General and failed. Many of those same Republicans conspired with the Democrat Party to kill educational freedom opportunities for parents in Texas, and on down that list of the Republicans who, frankly, just don't line up with the platform and to say, "I'm going to represent this party, but I don't agree with these principles." Well, you make that decision about who that person is in the primary election. And we have to decide in the primary process if we're going to base our decision of who we choose to go in there on a standard of principles that are proven, that we can look at somebody with all the best information we can and say, okay, we want you. Now, the question for us as the voters, as the people, and as the church is, are we going to use God's standard, or are we going to use man's standard? Are we going to use our own guiding principles for our own selfish reasons and say, what's in it for me? Or because I'm mad, or a variety of other reasons? Or are we going to say, what does God direct us to do in choosing leaders? What is his principles, his standards? And those all decisions are where we make in the primary election. And so, for example, when we look at the standard, we can find one of the simplest one in Exodus 18:21. And the context there is when Jethro came to Moses during the Exodus. And we well know the nature by this point of the tendency of the people to grumble, complain, and already in spite of God's major miracles of the Exodus itself, of the parting of the Red Sea, of these miracles occurring, that they still wanted to grumble and complain. But there was lots of grievances. And so Moses was lining the people up, and they would bring their grievances to him. Jethro came to Moses in Exodus 18, and he observed this and said, "Hey, this isn't good for you. It's not good for the people. They're lined up from morning until night." And so he says, what you need to do, and in Exodus 18:21 says, "You choose from among the people able men who fear God, who love the truth, and who hate dishonest gain. And you place them over thousands, over hundreds, over fifties, over tens. Then you reserve the most difficult situations for yourself." And essentially, in that passage, gave the outline of delegated authority, but also the standard by which you're to choose those leaders to make those decisions. And that four-pronged standard: number one, are they able? Number two, do they fear God? Is there a reverence and a record, and that's evident in their lives that they serve God? Number three, they love the truth. They're honest. Wouldn't that be? Isn't that a novel idea? An honest political leader. And they hate dishonest gain. Okay, they're not in it for their own gratification, their own self promotion, their own wealth, and to serve. That's our starting point, our baseline. Now, what if you have multiple candidates with that pass all four prongs of that test? I'd say that's a great problem to have, and pray to God that we had that in more districts and more races. That's desperately what we need. The problem is that we fall short of those prongs in too many races at all. And so we're using 3 out of 4, 2 out of 4, 1 out of 4 to try to get the best, or we're not using any standard at all. We're not even paying attention. We're not participating. So that's one prong of this. Number one, we're calling our pastors in these next 6 and 8 weeks and the weeks preceding this. We've got to prepare our people to get out and vote in the primary election. We don't get the option of just saying, we just had an election. We had one in November in the city of Houston, and state went on these measures. We just had an election. We talked about it then. It's too soon. Forget it. We've got lots of other things we want to do. We got Easter coming up. Well, that's true, but we don't have the latitude of abdicating our responsibility as stewards. And so we're frankly calling on all of our pastors. Let's step up, make sure you've enlisted somebody in your church to be your citizenship ministry leader who you can delegate this to carry these things out for you. So just like any other ministry track in the church, this is happening under your chip, under your scrutiny and accountability, but it's carrying out effectively to inform and educate and ground and activate our people in our churches to be biblical voters. That's not something we get to do by choice, frankly. And we have been too irresponsible for that in most of our churches. And part of our mission as a ministry, pastor council, is to say, no, it is a ministry. If you go to Romans 13, where that framework of passage of governing authority is very clear, it uses the term ministry. It is a minister of God for your good. It's a minister of wrath. That minister, the concept and term diakonos, to serve. So the citizenship of ministry demands, and since the authority of God comes through the people to those we choose, then it is incumbent upon us to participate. So, pastor, and we're going to be calling on you, and we're bringing resources to you, voter information. But really, this comes down to the pastor making this a priority, speaking to it, executing effectively a process by which we communicate to the congregation multiple times to make sure that they get out and participate and vote. And they have information where to, how to, and so forth. And then the second component of this, we're just going to touch on this briefly in this episode, and we'll get into greater details on the how on this, but it's called the precinct convention. What is that? The precinct convention. Well, how we talk about the party platform is relation to candidates aligning themselves up with a political party and its platform, a statement of principles. And that platform is drafted every 2 years. The national platform is drafted every 4 years. Who writes the platform? Guess what? The people write the platform. And what people write the platform? Where do they come from? Well, they're elected. Where are they elected from? Well, let's just talk about in 2024, there will be a national convention. The National Republican platform and the National Democrat platforms will be written by those elected by the states. Whoever the states send as their delegation to the National Convention will draft and vote on and adopt that platform. So how do those delegates at the state get sent to the National Convention? They have a state convention. Who's at the state convention? Those are delegates who are elected by their districts. So how do you get to the district convention? Who chooses the national delegates? Well, you get elected to the state convention at the district convention. So at your Senate district level, you will have a Senate district convention. And who goes to the Senate? You just show up. That's something anybody can go to. No, you have to get elected to your Senate district convention as well. Where do you get elected from there or from to get to the Senate district convention? And it's called your precinct. The precinct is the lowest level of the voting structure in our system. It's a neighborhood with political boundaries around it. Everybody lives in a precinct. And in Texas, there will be precinct conventions, and every county will handle those a little bit differently. Traditionally, they've been on the evening of the primary election. Some of the larger counties will choose to have group precinct conventions on another night. That's something we'll be getting information about. But here, the bottom line is those who show up at their precinct convention with the desire to do two things. Number one, bring resolutions of statements of principle you would like to have included in the platform. And those resolutions are all gathered and provided to the committee at the district level, who will compile those resolutions and then put it before that body, who will then adopt and send resolutions to the state convention, who will then compile it all and draft a state platform and boil it all down into a series of statements of principle and have a state platform. And that, to this political party, is to what scripture is to the church. It's really that important. Without a platform, the political party is just a group of people with different opinions. You have 100 different people in a room, you have 150 different opinions. Okay, so the truth of the matter is that without a platform, there's no standard of guiding principles that says this is what we believe. Now, that doesn't mean everybody adheres to them. One of the great frustrations in both parties, probably, especially the Republican Party, are those who run for the party based on that platform and then don't abide by those principles. That's another issue. And that's why it's so important we choose in the primary candidates who we believe have a reason to believe that they will commit themselves to those principles. But we write the principles. People who go to their precinct convention, bring resolutions, get elected to the district convention, bring those resolutions, get elected to the state convention, help write the platform. And in Texas, we also elect the state Republican chair and vice chair and national Republican positions at that state convention. It's the people who do that. So pastors, if we send our people out to participate in that process as well, we can bring a Christ-centered biblical influence to that. So that's another side of the involvement in the primary election process that's critically important. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into that in another episode. But I wanted to bring this before you right now. We're trying to put the word out to our churches. 6 weeks until showtime, 6 weeks, and then 8 weeks until March 5th election, the primary election. And we need to gear up and make sure we're informing our folks. And pastors, we care because it's God's authority that we are charged with delegating. The primary election is an important junction in the process of choosing godly leaders to government. Go to faithvotes.org. That's faithvotes.org on our website for more information. We'll be continuing to update that. Reach out to us if we can help you get that person in place. Pastor, you need that citizenship ministry leader, committee, whichever or both, to help you do this. We'll love to help you recruit that person, train that person. And Pastor, they need your leadership from the pulpit. So let's stay with us. Again, early voting begins on Tuesday, February 20th, and the primary election is Tuesday, March 5th. So those are important dates coming up in terms of our ministry of citizenship and our role as a ministry for the Texas and U.S. Pastor Councils to engage our pastors to lead our people to be faithful citizens. God bless.